I'm Andrew White. Thank you for coming tonight, and welcome to the New School. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is an applied research center here at the Milano School, which is officially now the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, where I also teach urban policy. So at Milano, we have a program in politics and advocacy. And so while the center usually hosts events that are around policy issues affecting the city, we always want to always every semester host one or two events that are more about politics than policy. Because the truth is you can't do good policy unless you have good politics. Tonight's forum is about the increasingly sophisticated strategies used by electoral campaigns. And I'm hoping it's also going to be a bit about how those strategies and techniques can be deployed not only on campaigns nationally and at the state level, but also here in New York and on issues, not just campaigns for individual people for public office. So what can we learn about the methods of the successful methods of the Obama campaign, and for that matter, about the terrific failures of the Romney field effort? And how can we use those issues? How can we use those lessons ourselves? How might the data-driven sophistication of political campaigns shape government as well? And how might it be shaping policy in the coming years and shaping politics more broadly? So we've got a great panel tonight. We'll also have time for audience questions. We're going to have a couple of people going around with microphones. In the latter part of the session, we're streaming live on the web, and we'll archive the video so that you can watch it later. And if you want to take part in the conversation on Twitter, there's #ObamaStrategy all set up. I want to introduce Jeff Smith. He is the Assistant Professor of Politics and Advocacy at the Milano School, and he's a former state senator who represented part of St. Louis in the Missouri legislature. But he seems to fit in just fine here in New York. Jeff.
Thank you. Yeah, they told me when I was moving from politics to academia to just buy a tweed blazer and I'd be fine. Anyway, thank you so much for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it on a chilly night here. We have a very esteemed group of panelists, and we'll meet them in turn. But first, I want to introduce you to Sasha Issenberg, author of The Victory Lab, who will be talking for about a half hour about his book. This election cycle was an interesting cycle. Most reporters who were covering the election cycle were very much involved in the day-to-day ups and downs of the roller coaster that is national politics. They were focused on Ann Romney's dressage horse and how it was going to fare in the Olympics. They were focused on Democratic strategist Hillary Rosen's comment about Ann Romney having never worked a day in her life. Just ridiculous things. I mean, hell, they covered Herman Cain. So,
hey.
There was one reporter who really stood out this cycle, though, for a very different reason. And it wasn't that there wasn't a lot of great reporting done this cycle by other reporters, but one guy decided he was going to take a different tack. He immersed himself in the campaigns to understand the technology, the data analytics, the minds, and the thinking that was really revolutionizing the way that politics was conducted this cycle. And that was Sasha Issenberg. I'm going to read, before I introduce him, a passage from a piece that he wrote in MIT's Tech Review, a publication that not too many political journalists are publishing in. Because as a former politician myself, this passage really struck me. Obama's campaign began the election year confident it knew the name of every one of the 69,456,897 Americans whose votes had put him in the White House. They may have cast those votes by secret ballot, but Obama's analysts could look at the Democrats' vote totals in each precinct and identify the people most likely to have backed him. Pundits talked in the abstract about reassembling Obama's 2008 coalition, but within the campaign, the goal was very literal. They would reassemble the coalition one by one. Sasha Issenberg is the Victory Lab columnist for Slate and the Washington correspondent for Monocle, where he covers politics, business, diplomacy, and culture. He covered the 2008 election as a national political reporter in the Washington bureau of the Boston Globe, and his work has also appeared in New York, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Monthly, Inc., The Atlantic, Boston, Philadelphia, and George, where he served as a contributing editor. His first book, The Sushi Economy, Globalization and the Making of a Modern Delicacy, was published by Gotham in 2008. And the Victory Lab, as you'll see, is right back there, and Sasha will be signing it immediately following tonight's event. Without further ado, Sasha Issenberg.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for putting together such a nice group of people to talk about a subject I care about. I've written mostly in the last couple of years and about real campaigns, but Jeff sort of suggested that we should expand the conversation to cover community activism and social change, which was already daunting enough since that's a little outside of my normal wheelhouse. And then I come in here and I realize that there's a blind Chinese dissident talking downstairs, and so I'm fairly certain I'll offer nothing insightful about social change. But I will try to unpack a little bit of the changes within the sort of culture and practice of campaigns that led to the most advanced campaign we've seen in history, the Obama campaign, having the ability, as Jeff read from that piece, to really disaggregate the electorate into individual units and have an unprecedented ability to track the movements or potential movements of individual voters' attitudes and behaviors. And explain a little bit about how we got to this point, what the Obama campaign did, and then hopefully what it means, and then we can start translating that to more potentially parochial concerns. This is the sort of the season where there are a lot of people writing about the last campaign, and at sort of postmortems like this, I think too often the conversation ends up trying to focus on some effort to define the one big thing that the campaign was about. There's sort of this, it's I think, a reflex of political journalists and the operatives who are asked to reflect on things, and pundits, to try to sort of reduce a campaign to a single strategic move or one innovation or technique or one demographic group or state or issue that sort of made the difference. And I think that this is, something we're seeing in the analysis of what happened last year. It certainly is a big part of this debate within the Republican Party and the conservative movement about what went wrong. And this, the thing that I've come to appreciate in the last few years of sort of reporting within this kind of geek subculture in campaigns is that I think that the whole project of trying to reduce campaigns to being about one big thing, trying to vest explanatory power in a single strategy or state or demographic group is totally conceptually flawed way to understand the results of an election. And the smartest people within campaigns never think or talk in those terms. And part of that is because they now have two sort of radical new tools to measure small things in campaigns. And the big things remain a real mystery. I mean, there have been a lot of claims made recently by people inside and outside the campaigns that it was Obama's decision to spend money early that made the difference, or it was the Bain ads that the Priorities Super PAC ran in the early summer that were the thing that moved, or it was all about increased margins, turnout margins among core parts of the demographic group. It's it's a sort of a fool's errand, given the tools we have to understand what happened to sort of impute causality or credit to either of those things. We do have the ability now to measure a lot of little things in politics, and those innovations are the things I'll sort of talk about in the way that the Obama campaign fused those two innovations and was able to sort of do something entirely different. About a decade ago, people in politics realized that companies knew a whole lot more about their customers than campaigns or parties did. Campaigners have traditionally been limited by, when looking at individual voters, by the information that's on your registration form, your name, your address, your date of birth, so your age, gender, in some places race or ethnicity. Then if you register with a party, as is the case in New York, and that's there, the history of elections in which you voted. And it became possible with basically the beginning of punch card computing to organize information about basically the neighborhoods in which people voted, how your precinct had performed in past elections, taking census information, which gives a sense of the racial and ethnic complexion of a neighborhood, socioeconomic status, education levels, household type. But campaigns were sort of restricted in sifting through the electorate by the sort of limits of these two categories. They either had to basically triage the electorate by geographical units, by precincts or assembly districts, or the level at which you actually had past political performance, or these big demographic categories as they exist on your as are visible on your voter registration form. But the private sector had created these consumer data warehouses that gathered all sorts of information about individuals, starting in the 50s to develop credit rating scores. And this was information that some of which comes from magazines that sell lists of their subscribers, or cruise companies that will sell lists of their passengers, but also a lot of information that we give away when we fill out warranty forms or customer service questionnaires, where you write down what your household income is, or you check off a range and how many kids you have in your house, all of which is information that's often very hard to get through other means, but you give it away and it gets collected and resold. And the largest commercial data warehouses have hundreds, if not thousands, of individual data points about people that are a lot richer in texture than what's on your registration form. And it became possible a decade ago with changes in computing power and database architecture to link up registration forms with these much richer troves of individual data. And campaigns started running statistical models, algorithms, to look for patterns between the characteristics of individual voters and what they knew about voter attitudes from large-scale polls that are much larger than the 700,000 person samples that were probably driving most of us batty every hour throughout the fall, but calling thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people in a state where instead of having 9 rural college-educated women in your sample, all of a sudden you have 250 rural college-educated African-American women in your sample, and you can start to find relationships between individual attributes and attitudes that are sort of imperceptible in the bigger polls. And those statistical models ended up producing what is sort of now the new currency for sorting through the electorate, which are a series of scores. And the Obama campaign in 2008, and again this year, as most campaigns now on the left have done, rely on a series of scores. There's 0 to 100. It's a percentage likelihood that you will basically perform a certain action. And the two things that the campaign is most interested in is how likely are you to vote. It's a percentage likelihood that you will turn out, a turnout score, and whom you're likely to support, who you would vote for when you do. And that's a support score, a 0 to 100 likelihood that in this case you'd support Barack Obama. And what that allows a campaign to do, these basically serve as the political world's version of credit rating scores. And so in the same way that 50 years ago, if you wanted to take out a loan, you had to go and meet individually with a loan officer at a financial institution and have that person make a sort of individualized decision about whether to give you money. Credit rating scores allowed lenders to automate that process, and so in the same way that a bank won't give you a loan or a line of credit without having a quantitative prediction of your likelihood of defaulting or paying off your bill on time. A campaign will not send somebody now to knock on your door, send you a piece of mail, or a robocall without a quantitative projection of your likelihood of casting a ballot or being one of their supporters or being pro-choice or being a gun owner or some other issues that they care about. And what this has allowed campaigns to do is free themselves from those big, or free voters actually, from those large demographic categories or political categories like partisanship that are on your registration records, or the geographic boundaries that are sort of arbitrary of precincts and districts, and sort through the electorate and find the people that they, on an individual level, that they want to interact with. And so now a campaign can isolate the 2 people on a block that they want to mobilize and the 3 people in an apartment building that they want to persuade, and have an idea of who among the 2 of which 2 out of those 3 they want to send their standard message on jobs, and which person they'll send a message on contraception. I think one of the underappreciated stories of Obama's ability to expand the map in 2008 and again in 2012 to compete in states like Virginia or North Carolina or Indiana, where there had not been a sort of standard math or map for a Democrat running a presidential campaign, is that basically the campaign could look everywhere for votes. And if you start thinking about plucking out individuals where you can make an impact, all of a sudden you might start looking in counties where you're only going to win 21% of the vote, but you can think about how to maximize that. And you don't necessarily need a massive organization in the whole county, but if you have 50 volunteers, and you can get them each to knock on 20 doors over the course of the fall, you can figure out which 1,000 doors you'll make the most impact on, and then it's worth opening up a field office to support those volunteers, and that's, I think, an important part of understanding that the nexus between the very ambitious volunteer-based field operation that Obama's done and the use of data. So then the question is, so you get to the door, what do you do there? And there, politics has been transformed in the last 10, 15 years by an innovation that came not out of the commercial world or consumer marketing, but out of academia. The use of field experiments, of randomized control trials to measure cause and effect. In my book, I tell the story of 2 professors at Yale, Don Green and Alan Gerber, who in the fall of 1998 went out on the streets of New Haven to conduct their first field experiment, which was a pretty radical thing to do in political science, which had for a variety of reasons, some good and some bad, had lagged behind many of the other social sciences in using empirical field work. Gerber and Green went out and initially designed this very basic experiment to measure their ability to mobilize voters. They created they partnered with the local League of Women Voters chapter to create a nonpartisan get out the vote drive. They randomly assigned a group of New Haven voters into 4 categories. A quarter of them got a get out the vote reminder by mail on a postcard. A quarter of them got a phone call from a paid call center. A quarter of them got an in-person visit from a canvasser, mostly grad students. And then there was a quarter who were in a control group who got nothing. And then after the election, you can go and you can look at the electoral rolls and you can see who actually cast a ballot. And it turns out that the people who got the phone call saw no increase in their likelihood of voting. The people who got the mail had a small but appreciable increase in their turnout, and the people who got the in-person visit saw a huge boost. And they had trouble getting the study published in academic journals. I think in my book I describe it as embarrassingly practical. But people in the political world took notice of it in a way that most scholarly articles don't get attention there. And there tended to be, one of two reactions among political consultants. There was, oh great, academics have developed a scientifically credible tool for authoritatively disentangling cause and effect and measuring the impact of things that we convince campaigns to spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on every year. Then there was another reaction, which was, oh no, academics have developed a scientifically credible tool to measure whether these things we get people to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on every year actually work. And you had this little civil war where, the phone vendors who would sell robocalls to campaigns would be, or the people who sold mail to campaigns would be sending this article around to argue that the campaign shouldn't spend money on robocalls. But there happened to be a sort of very small cadre initially of people in that first group, many of them in the sort of permanent institutions of the left, labor union, some of the women's groups, that said that were actually excited about this and said, not only should we be looking at the findings from this study and some other ones that Gerber and Green did to learn what works, but we're out there every year doing politics, and why don't we start running our own experiments? And so over the next few years, you had in this sort of a growing research subculture that combined people in academia and people in political professionals who started testing not only is a phone call better than a piece of mail, but are 2 phone calls better than 1 phone call, and should the last piece of mail arrive on the Thursday before the election or the Friday? And does it work in Spanish, and does it work in rural areas? And within 5 years, basically every permutation of this comparative effectiveness stuff for mobilizing and then eventually registering voters had been tested. And you get a series of big breakthroughs in the middle of the last decade when people in politics start to look for lessons in the behavioral sciences, especially psychology, about how to motivate people. And we can talk about this a little bit more because we have some examples here of translating findings that have been demonstrated in spheres other than politics about how to motivate people to do things and trying to translate them to encourage people to vote. I won't go into too much detail on that now, but the other sort of big strand of using experiments, which has been much slower to come into politics, is using experiments to understand how to change people's opinions or what changes their opinions. The easiest things to measure in an experiment are turnout and registration, because there's a very clear dependent variable, which is, did somebody register, did somebody vote, which is publicly available. You can get it from the Board of Elections. It's effectively free, it's universal. So experiments that measure those 2 impacts are pretty easy. Understanding what is actually moving people is really difficult. And traditionally, campaigns have relied on sort of artificial settings to understand which of their arguments will be persuasive in moving people. And so campaigns either use focus groups where you get a bunch of people together in a room and you give them $75 in sandwiches and read them bits of text or show them ads or show them pieces of mail and then ask what changes what changes their minds. And this process has significant limitations, namely that none of us watch TV ads with 11 strangers. None of us are regularly prompted to have opinions about the TV ads that we have. And you talk to people who run these focus groups, and you sort of hear regularly that, the first person has an opinion about an ad, and then everybody, to feel like they earn their $75 in sandwiches, needs to have their own opinion about an ad. And by the end of it, people are claiming that their entire political worldview has been changed by this totally banal 30-second exercise in superficial messaging. And then the other tool would be polls for message testing, where polls will ask something like, if you learn that Mitt Romney had outsourced jobs while CEO of Bain Capital, would it make you more or less likely to vote for him? Which is, if you think about it, a really crazy thing to ask somebody. If I gave you a piece of information that you may or may not already know, would it at some indeterminate but hypothetical point in the future change an opinion that you may or may not already have. But that's basically how campaigns decide what to talk to voters about. Using experiments, and particularly a method that's known as experiment-informed programs, it's known as EIP among folks who do it, especially on the left. The idea is to go take that message testing out into the real world. It's most easily done with mail. The idea is that you send people mail, they receive it, they don't know that they're under observation, and you're randomly assigning different types of mail to voters. And campaigns that are running these micro-targeting models, developing these scores, are doing a massive volume of ongoing polling throughout the campaign anyway. And so when you combine the ability to use experiments to actually isolate the cause and effect of who's moving with hundreds of individual data points about voters, you can determine not just which messages are moving individual people, but the characteristics of people who are moving. And so what the Obama campaign did this year, which no other candidate campaign had ever done in a significant way, was run a series of these EIPs on different issues at different points in the campaign. And so, for example, they ran one on healthcare early on. It was the first, I think, in March. And they randomly assigned, they did it, I believe it was just women were in the sample. But they sent people different types of mailers about Obamacare. Some were, traditional looking, glossy mail. Some were letters that came in envelopes that looked like they were coming from like an insurance company or something. It said paid for by the Democratic National Committee on the bottom, but they didn't look like political messaging. And it said something like, under the Affordable Care Act, you're now entitled to one free checkup every year from your insurance company. Take the time now to call your doctor and schedule an appointment to take advantage of this provision. And they ran a few other ones. And what they were able to do was see that different types of messages actually change people's opinions about Obamacare depending on their age or whether they're in multiple person households or married, characteristics that are not showing up necessarily on their voter registration form. And you're not asking people in an artificial setting, hey, if I told you that you got a free checkup, would it change your opinion? You're sending them the mail, and if they throw out the mail, never look at it, or it doesn't move them, either way you're measuring that impact. That was one way that the campaign merged the sort of micro-targeting with experiments. The other way was they ran a large-scale test involving over 500,000 voters early in 2012, and had volunteers call voters with a persuasion message, a sort of script that guided them to make some arguments for Obama. Now, campaigns traditionally do not like using volunteers for persuasion. Campaigns like using volunteers to go register people. They like using volunteers to do get out the vote work. That's most of, and to go out and do IDs, to go ask people 2 or 3 basic questions. Do you plan to vote? Who do you plan to vote for? Maybe what do you think about this issue? In that case, you're asking your volunteers just to get information from people. The worst that could happen is that they refuse to answer. If you're sending them out to mobilize people, by definition, you're sending them to talk to people that you assume or know are likely to be your supporters. If you use volunteers for persuasion, you are, by definition, sending them to people that you think don't support you, are undecided or ambivalent. Often late in the campaign, those are people who are not that interested in political communication, or people that you think are your supporters but you have reason to be worried about defecting. And in all of those cases, campaigns recognize that you are putting volunteers in a potentially combustible position by having them go make an argument for you with people that probably are not going to be initially receptive to it. And talk to people who run field offices, and one of the sort of great perplexes of doing this is that the most enthusiastic, active volunteers are often the ones you least want delivering your message, because they don't understand how somebody could possibly not support John McCain, or they will argue to the death about why the candidate is better in a way that could potentially antagonize somebody, or they think that they know the candidate's positions better than anybody, or they knew, the campaign may be talking about the auto bailout, but they really think that people are going to want to hear about transvaginal ultrasounds. And the campaign has spent, millions of dollars testing their messages on something, and now all of a sudden you're putting it in the hands of an enthusiastic but well-meaning person, sort of remixing it for you on the spot. And so campaigns traditionally stayed away from that. The Obama campaign, because they had such an immense capacity to recruit, develop volunteer networks, wanted to figure out a way to sort of crack the code of how to use the volunteers, not just for mobilization, but for persuasion. Knowing in particular that it's harder to reach people on traditional television, targeting online is still a very difficult and imperfect process, and that more than ever before, you'd have incredibly crowded communications channels in the fall of 2012. And so they ran this experiment where they put volunteers in the position of making phone calls to voters, and using this large scale polling that they were doing, they were able to see which voters changed their opinions over the course of the next week. And they came up with a new score. It was a 0 to 10 score, predicting the persuadability of a voter, the likelihood that a voter would become more likely to support Barack Obama after having an interaction with one of the campaign's volunteers. And so a 10 meant that you were very likely to be persuaded by this interaction. A 0, I actually suggested that you could, anti-persuaded is the term they used, but that you were likely to have a backlash and become less likely to support Obama after hearing the arguments that the volunteer made. And what this allowed the campaign to do, so here they were using experiments and micro-targeting to, on one hand, measure which of their messages were actually moving people in the real world. And they used these experimental techniques to identify which voters they could use volunteers to move. And what those two things together allowed them to do is to sort of fully disaggregate the electorate into a series of individuals and measure not only where an individual was at a given point in time, which had traditionally been the way that micro-targeting had been used. Micro-targeting, which is a term that people started using in 2004, we heard a lot about how the Bush campaign used it that year, was initially thought of a way to basically segment the electorate based on static characteristics. You go out and at the beginning of the campaign, you sort through voters, you put them in different categories, and then you use that for your program. In 2008, the Obama campaign, using these scores and this ongoing large-scale polling, would update people's scores every week, so that as public opinion moved, your individual likelihood of supporting Barack Obama or casting a ballot would move as well. And it allowed the campaign to sort of be constantly adjusting the universes of people that they were talking to at different times or on different messages based on that. What happened in 2012 was that they took that idea of sort of dynamic scoring of individuals, the idea that as the dynamics of the campaigns change, the campaign can adjust their likelihood of thinking of you as a target, the same way that if a bunch of people with graduate degrees start defaulting on their mortgages, banks will start seeing that in credit scores and adjust their lending practices. But because they had done these experiments, they also were able to quantify the likelihood that they could change your opinion or modify your behavior. And so this will bring us to the discussion, but I think that the sort of big transformation and the real challenge is how you take this for a campaign that doesn't have $1 billion and 4 years and access to some of the some incredibly talented people both inside and outside politics. But you take this logic of trying to restore the sort of sovereignty of the individual voter and the sort of empirical tools to understand the power that a campaign can have in changing somebody's opinions or modifying their behavior and apply it to sort of other challenges in politics. Thank you.
That was educational. Thank you so much, Sasha. That was great. It reminded me of many things in my life. One was when I was had just finished my master's. I was getting ready to do my PhD, and I asked the chair of my academic department in political science if I could take a year break to go work on Bill Bradley's presidential campaign. She told me...
You didn't do the whole year, did you?
Funny. But she told me she could not possibly imagine any endeavor more irrelevant to my training as an academic than to go work on a campaign. So that kind of illustrates what Gerber and Green were up against. And when you talked about the volunteers wanting to, the most persuasive, the most zealous volunteers oftentimes struggling the most to actually persuade people. It reminded me of a time when I had a volunteer who went out and she came in 2 hours later. We asked her how many doors she knocked on. She said 3. I said, what happened? She said, well, I argued with one guy for 90 minutes. Anyway, lots of great nuggets there. So thank you very much, Sasha. Now I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. Maggie Haberman is here. Maggie is a senior political writer for Politico and one of their top stars, which in real terms means that she's already filed 3 stories since the panel started. Prior to that, she worked at the New York Post, where she covered the 2008 presidential election, along with many state, city, and congressional races. She also worked at the New York Daily News, where she focused extensively on the rebuilding around the World Trade Center in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. In 2012, she co-authored Politico's main election blog, Burns and Haberman, on 2012. She lives in New York City with her family. Thanks for being here, Maggie.
Thanks for having me.
We have Jonathan Rosen. Jonathan is a principal and co-founder of Berlin Rosen and heads the firm's strategic communications and media relations practice. In that capacity, he serves as the senior communications strategist and advisor to leading elected officials, companies, nonprofit organizations, and unions. In 2012, Crane's New York Business named him to its 40 under 40 list of New York leaders. Jonathan's a graduate of the NYU School of Law. He lives in Park Slope, Brooklyn, with his wife, Debbie, and their 2 young children. Jonathan is active in many of the current city campaigns, including the de Blasio for mayor campaign, and so I'm sure he'll work in some anecdotes close to home tonight. Blake Zeff is a veteran political strategist, writer, and commentator who served in senior positions on leading presidential campaigns, a veteran of both the Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama campaigns in 2008. Not many people that you can probably say that about.
Except for Hillary Clinton.
And Blake also has served in senior positions in communications in the United States Senate. You can see his analysis regularly in places like BuzzFeed, the New York Daily News, and Capital New York. He's also frequently a guest on MSNBC's Hardball with Chris Matthews, Jansen & Co., MSNBC Live, Weekends with Alex Witt, and News Nation with Tamron Hall, in addition to appearing on CNBC and CNN. He has spoken at many venues about politics, including Brown University, Columbia, NYU, and the Parliament of Finland. He's a graduate of Brown University. So, again, thank you all for coming tonight. I would like to get started by, in the vein that I think Sasha ended on here, which is, given the significant investment that it requires to build a data analytics team. What did you say? There were 54 people who worked in...
Just in the analytics department. They have people doing stuff with numbers in every department in the campaign, yeah.
Okay.
Hundreds of people
So
doing
several
numbers,
hundred
yeah.
people working in technology. So given the investment, besides all the voter contact people and targeting and modeling, how can smaller campaigns, like the ones that Jonathan is working on, city council races here in the city, how can they take these lessons and apply them without the benefit of a full analytics department? Why don't I start with Jonathan, and then you weigh in, Sasha?
Sure. So I think, first, thanks for having us here.
Sure.
It's almost as good as the Parliament of Finland. It's a story we'll get later. Do you remember that? I do remember your Finland trip. So anyway, so you think of the Obama campaign, both 2008 and 2012, as almost like the Bell Labs of politics. It's not often you have a $1 billion corporation almost that can bring together all this talent have all this time, right? A lot of people don't start running for office with 4 years. I mean, they had the advantage of winning, the next day realizing they were going to do it again 4 years later, having all they learned in '08 and immediately sort of investing it in 12. And I think the answer is for local elections and sort of even state and congressional elections in most places is a lot of these things already are flowing into these things. Some I think are still to come, just from a sort of scale and cost perspective. I mean, surely we are seeing micro-targeting at races kind of above the city council and state legislative level. It is cost effective if you're spending $300,000 in voter contact, which you probably are in a campaign with a budget of $500,000 or higher, to throw $20,000 or $30,000, at least at that first cut of micro-targeting, of doing the kind of 5,000 person poll, and then using statistical analysis to actually segment your electorate. Might mean you can cut off part of your voter contact universe and it's paying for itself. And not surprisingly, a lot of the smartest people in the Obama campaign who were doing this work are now out hanging shingles, helping campaigns at the state and local level on the back end with those surveys and doing the analytics and the crunching. Some of the people you write about, Ken Strasma, other people are very much sort of in the local and state marketplace working with campaigns to sort of take that data and make it useful. So that's here. What's also here, and I think has been here for a long time, particularly in New York City, is the Gerber and Green stuff. A lot of the institutions of the permanent left are basically our client base at Berlin Rosa. The investments in canvassing, voter contact, door-to-door organizing, I think have been at the root of a phenomenon we've seen nationally, but also in New York, where groups that a lot of the zeitgeist say are in decline, like unions, like community organizations, are sort of punching well above their weight in politics. Now, I think you saw it in New York City in 2009, and both remember those races where a coalition of unions in the Working Families Party ran races, often against established county organizations, often being sort of the less spending ones, and often without the same media endorsements, and had an incredible year, largely because I think if you look at the budgets of those campaigns, they disproportionately invested in the kinds of voter contact methods that Gerber and Green talked about. You look at institutions like most of organized labor and sort of their affiliates and coalitions that take different names in different places, there are many years now of sort of large-scale investments in that kind of voter contact, year in, year out, and you're seeing that in issue campaigns too. What's not here yet, though I'm sure someone will figure out how to scale it and make it cost-effective, is the sort of continuous feedback loop, the sort of persuasion piece. I think campaigns have figured out at the sort of below $1 billion level how to do that first $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 piece of research to do that initial bit of micro-targeting. The resources to continue to track throughout, the nightly sort of tracking. There are very, very few campaigns running at the city or even statewide level in most places. I mean, I think in some of the bigger markets like California, maybe that'll change, where there's budget to do that sort of continuous feedback loop. But again, if you think of the Obama campaign like a Bell Labs, I think those prices will go down as people figure out technology to sort of commodify that and push that out. I think it's only sort of yet to come.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. One thing that so I think the question is that applies to campaigns everywhere is there's this constant sort of chase of we want micro-targeting or we want this or we want that.
Sure.
And people are often not asking the right question, which is like, what problem am I trying to solve? I think the thing that which you identify correctly, and I'll just amplify, that people have tended to misunderstand, I think, about micro-targeting. The assumption is that it is all about finding like these magical pockets of people that you didn't know existed and sending them these like arcane niche messages that only they will respond to and that like the media will never pick up on. It's certainly capable of, you can use statistical modeling and lots of individual data to do that. But what you see in campaigns is that most of the time at any level, most voters want to hear about the same 2 or 3 issues. Barack Obama could have found like 4,000 people in Ohio who really cared about fur tariffs and just like bombarded them with like direct mail and robocalls about fur tariffs. But those people probably wanted to hear about like the economy.
Romney Lyme disease.
Yes,
folks from
right,
Virginia.
and so this is like, and so the real value that this type of modeling and targeting has to any campaign is finding efficiencies. Is, you know, I think the most underappreciated decision that any campaign makes, and one that we as journalists do a horrible job writing about, is the first decision of who don't I talk to, which basically is figuring out people whose votes you can take for granted, or people who will never support you, and pushing them entirely out of your mind, both in terms of not wasting voter contact resources, volunteer time interacting with them, but also removing them from your strategic calculations, so that you're not writing every speech with the idea of some imaginary target who is either somebody who's already in your camp or is ungettable. And micro-targeting is the best tool to do that sort of first triage where you're splitting off those people and you are left with voters who should be your targets, and then you're understanding who exactly you're trying to persuade and whom exactly you're trying to mobilize within that group, and then develop, using some of the experimental insights, individualized prescriptions for each. I'll just say that, you know, one way that the left has, it's not just that the Obama campaign was better than the Romney campaign in almost every respect, but that the left has created a real electioneering intelligentsia, and one of the institutions that's been created, this group called the Analyst Institute, exists to not only coordinate experiments among campaigns and party institutions and groups like labor unions, but to disseminate findings from those experiments. And especially in election years, they run, you know, any number of trainings and phone calls and conference calls and put together best practices sheets that are filled with all things that are free. A lot of it is small changes in language to canvassing scripts or phone scripts that are based on experiments, many of which have public and published. But, you know, for example, we know that there was a series of experiments that show that if you talk up turnout as being high, you say, you know, more people voted in the last election for mayor of New York than any other election in the city's history. We expect big turnout on Tuesday, as opposed to turnout was at a lower rate in the last election for mayor of New York than any other election in the city's history. Don't be part of the problem of low participation. Probably both of those facts are true because of population growth. People respond several points higher to being told that voting is popular. That's totally free. Any campaign for any level office can adjust the scripts that you have your 9 volunteers say when they knock on people's door the day before the election. And one of the things that was really staggering to me this fall is I went out, you know, the last weekend before the election, I was in Ohio, went out with canvassers for both Romney and Obama, and I could have taken the Obama canvassing script and basically footnoted it with citations to publicly available academic journal articles that have been done by political scientists, psychologists, economists, showing each of these little shifts in language that have had measurable impacts. And I went out with a volunteer for the Romney RNC coordinated operation, and their scripts look like something that somebody would have written in '97 before these guys from Yale went out and did their first experiment. And the RNC could have sent an intern across the street to the Library of Congress with, you know, a photocopy card for a week and said, like, go read every journal that's done an experiment about mobilization and come back to us, and they didn't. And so I think one of the challenges, and the opportunities are far more available to folks on the left, is to sort of, you know, insinuate yourselves into the space where this information is flowing, because there are a lot of things you can do for free that just require sort of being tapped into the ideas.
I want to make one comment on that. I think that's radically reshaping issue communications. I think the decks that come out of the Analyst Institute that we get at our office, you know, become like big conversations. And with clients, and I think, I don't know, I can't speak to the RNC, but we definitely have clients in issue advocacy where they are really skeptical that these things couldn't possibly be true. You read about Hal Malchow's Manila, like the sort of plain letter experiment, and that, you know, the campaign he was, I don't remember which campaign it was, but people were resistant to that. There was a similar experiment that he did actually in 2011 around the Walker recall on Right to Work. that showed very similar effects in issue communications and moving people to take legislative action, to call their legislature. And we had a client facing a very similar thing in a Midwestern state. We argued to them they should shift a lot of their budget away from glossy communications and TV and into these plain letters and find community people. And they thought that was, they thought it was crazy. And we ended up showing them the deck mail institute and bringing it out there. And to this day, they talk about, we got to do the plain letter thing again. And it really is reshaping. It was probably the most successful piece of voter.
These are experiments to show that you send people ugly mail and they actually respond to it. The guy who was designing it basically, the way that people who do direct mail have always talked to is you need to cut through the clutter and so we'll make it, really big and colorful and glossy. And his insight was, let's make it look like it's a jury summons or like a letter from the IRS or, a warning that you hadn't paid your water bill, that's more likely to actually cut through the clutter. And it turns out, by every measure, that it actually, people's behavior changes and they respond to that.
And the Obama folks use that on email as well. It was
Right.
Yeah.
Big.
Like the Obama folks, I think, found that their best fundraising email subject line was, "Hey."
Right.
Nothing complicated, just hey. So there's a lot of things. You all raised the point of like these counterintuitive findings. One that you've written about, Sasha, was that when they tested some of the Medicare messages, it wasn't seniors that were most responsive to those messages. It was actually people between like 45 and 65. And so I think, in the plain letter example, obviously. So what were some other things that I think were either where places that the conventional wisdom was just wrong in the 2012 campaign, and what were some of the wrong lessons, that pundits and practitioners are taking away from the 2012 campaign? Let me start with Maggie.
I think that I have a couple of thoughts about this, but one of the things that went through my head when you were saying the question was something Sasha wrote before the election about how it had occurred to him that enthusiasm did not matter, that enthusiasm was completely overrated as a concept in elections, and I think that's half true. I think it can matter, but I think that the idea that the Romney campaign created this notion with a press corps that was trying to do sort of a false equivalence by being fair and thinking that then meant that you were taking things that they were saying that later turned out to just basically either be ridiculous or lies, and saying, well, I'm treating these two things fairly, and I, at times, also treated credibly some of the things they said that turned out not to be the case. I think, so I think that in terms of things that turned out.
Pennsylvania.
Right. Look, I actually don't think that there was that much conventional wisdom that turned out to be wrong, other than the main one would be that it was a tight race. It was never really a tight race. It was always a very static race that was divided by a couple of points. But, the couple of points was not a small win in the modern era, as you know. And electorally, it was clearly not small. I think one thing that I thought was very important that the Obama folks did much better than the Romney campaign, and this is not something that Sasha did, something that I did write about a lot, was the ad strategy. I disagree with something you said, and I think Sasha probably is more on your side of this than mine, but I don't think that I mostly because I refuse to believe that most of what I do every day doesn't matter, but I don't think that
I wasn't saying it didn't matter.
No, I'm kidding. But I do think that, I certainly think that we all got very caught up on sort of, I guess if I had to point to a piece of conventional wisdom that turned out to be wrong, was there was some notion that anything that we did on any given day that involved Twitter mattered, right? I mean, so you pointed to the Hillary Rosen example. This was an absurdly navel-gazing campaign, and I don't mean in terms of the press coverage per se. I think actually more in terms of the way mostly the Romney campaign was waging it. The Obama campaign was able to do sort of the navel-gazy, silly Twitter stuff because they had other people doing other things. But the Romney campaign was literally waging this entire campaign over Twitter. So, for instance, and reporters were feeding off of that. This thing with Eric Ferenstrom, the Romney advisor, who made the Etch-a-Sketch comment that blew up. Most of us ended up writing about that because it was blowing up on Twitter, which is not necessarily the reason to cover anything. In terms of the ad strategy, this was an area where the Romney campaign was dramatically outgunned, and this is not about micro-targeting as much, it's just about competence. But in terms of the, well, I mean, it was an astonishingly bad ad strategy. The Obama campaign's ads were not good initially. They got much better, but the initial ones were kind of off. But what they did was they had a huge media buying staff, and they reserved time early, and they sort of knew where they were going to be playing. The Romney campaign had one person doing all of these reservations. She was leading a team of like 4 people. The Obama campaign had about 24. And they were buying time week to week as opposed to well in advance, which makes no sense because in a presidential campaign, presumably you actually know what states you're going to need. There comes down to like 12 battlegrounds at the end. So in terms of conventional wisdom that ended up being wrong, I think that this idea that we had, and I mean, I was actually being serious though about what you said is correct. This idea that Hillary Rose nor any of that mattered is ridiculous. The Bain stuff I disagree. I think that did matter. I think that was
the
really
47% comment
Absolutely.
clearly mattered.
Yeah,
Like,
and-
there were junctures of the campaign. I'm not
Sure.
saying nothing that happened.
No.
there.
And the 47% mattered because this predicate had been laid
Yeah.
in terms of Bain. But it was also fed because Romney was a terrible candidate who never tried to define himself. So I think that the conventional wisdom that sort of this day-to-day horse race coverage shaped things and was changing a race and making it fluid, that was not true. It was never a fluid race.
Well, your skepticism about Twitter is duly noted. So you don't think that... They
Not
should
that I
just-
still will stop using it, but
So you don't think they should just kind of cancel the New Jersey Senate campaign and just give the seat to Cory Booker?
I think that, well, I mean, I think that he is waging a very effective race on Twitter. I think that Cory Booker is a very good example of a politician who is existing well within the confines of the World Wide Web, and I think has had a bit of a rocky outing as he has tried to step out from that in the last couple of weeks, which is not to say, by the way, I do think that he will probably be the next senator. I think that's... I think it's unlikely that Lautenberg will run unless he feels so pressured because he has money of his own that he can spend. I think that Cory Booker is learning the hard way the point that I was making before, that there are other factors that matter, and I think that was what the Romney people also struggled with.
Yeah, absolutely. Blake,
Yeah,
what
sure.
are your thoughts?
In Finnish. So, what do you? Oh, in Finnish, please. I'll do English for this. So, I kind of want to answer both of the last few questions, if I may. In terms of Maggie's.
Sorry about that.
No. I just am warning everyone that
I
I'm
can
gonna
see
jump around.
Finland from here.
Maggie's point about the conventional wisdom in terms of the closeness of the race, I think, is a really interesting point because it kind of dovetails to a larger theme we're talking about, which is the importance of actually trusting quantitative data versus conventional wisdom and intuition and instinct. And if you actually just looked at the numbers in the presidential campaign and the general election, it really wasn't a close race, not just because Obama was up 2 or 3 points or whatever in most national polls, but also because that's not how it's won. We don't have a national popular vote that determines the elections. It's based on the Electoral College, as most people here I'm sure know. But that was so rarely talked about. It was very often talked like a sports score, 50-48 or whatever. But in fact, it was never really very close if you looked at the Electoral College and did it that way. So that was one thing that I completely agree with Maggie in terms of the conventional wisdom being wrong. Also, Jeff, you sort of quickly mentioned, I think it was Jeff who said it, about hey being the most popular, I guess, email subject line. And I think that's actually kind of interesting because when we talk about the challenge for local campaigns and other campaigns and issue campaigns, trying to translate these types of practices, and it's very difficult to, when you don't have $1 billion or 4 years or whatever, email is something that, all campaigns can and do use, and this is one of the lessons where you really can actually afford to do these random experiments. Everyone can do email. It doesn't cost you much. You have the time to kind of experiment. What is the language that people are responding to? For subject headings, for example, the technology is readily available to almost everyone to see what are the open and click rates based on the subject headings that we have. So I just wanted to point out that is one very tiny micro example where I think that that is accessible for everyone.
I think there's a big bit of, it's not necessarily conventional wisdom that's wrong, but I think sort of people's instincts are pulled in the wrong place, and I think it manifested itself in this race, which is there's a constant assumption that a lot of people inside politics, and especially people who are spending money inside politics, make, and I think bad media coverage sort of supports it, that the most innovative, advanced things have to be involving technology. Like that the delivery device has to be on a screen, right? So there's this, you look at the last few campaign cycles and people get obsessed with social media or with mobile or whatever, and there's this weird conflation of assuming that because the delivery device is new and advanced, that therefore the analytics are sophisticated or that the tactics are refined. Turns out to be almost entirely the opposite. There are things you can measure online which are easy and cheap to measure online, like click-through rates or donation levels based on randomizing subject lines or the content of messages or the design of a splash page. But there are real limits of what you can measure online because we still have a really difficult time linking who people are online to who they are in the real world. And politics still, the ultimate actions in politics take place in the real world. You vote with your real name at a street address, and campaigns, especially for fundraising, it doesn't necessarily matter initially they know who you are, but if they want to mobilize or persuade you, they definitely want to know who you are and want to leverage all the information that they have about you that's tethered to your real life identity. And there are huge hurdles that remain in linking your online presence to that information. And so all of the most important analytical advances that I talked about are all things that have manifest themselves in a most pronounced way in making people smarter about knowing which doors to knock on and where to send postcards. And in many respects, the internet is a backwards place for sort of measuring that stuff. And I think that the way that this becomes problematic is I know Maggie and I share a fascination with this Romney campaign initiative called Orca, which was this mobile app that the campaign developed that was supposed to be part of a platform of election day reporting where volunteers would stand inside polling places and would strike individual voters from basically a roster of registrants as they came in and cast a ballot. Then the idea would be that sort of in the second half of the day, the campaign would be able to see who among their targets had yet to cast a ballot, and then they would be able to hit these people with robocalls or have volunteers call them and motivate them to vote. Campaigns for years tried to do sort of real-time monitoring on election day, and one thing that good party organizations all over the country have done is figure out ways to have there are poll watchers or volunteers, that go back decades, and people will start with a stack of index cards with a list of all of their targets in the precinct, and then as somebody comes in, you remove their name from the card, and the stack shrinks over the course of the day, and then at 3 p.m. you give your stack of cards to some runners, and they split them up, and then people go and take the cards, and they knock on the doors, they call the people. The question is how you translate that into using the fact that how you leverage mobile technology and do that in a more automated way. The Romney campaign thought that technology itself would be the solution to mobilizing people. And
what was your tweet that day that they confused this with a GOTV program?
Yeah, and so they thought that
Or
knowing
voter
who hadn't
program,
voted
right.
at 3 p.m. solved all your get out the vote problems. And Orca was an epic disaster for any number of reasons, like the software didn't work and they didn't give people instructions and the passwords were
Crashed
wrong
that
and,
morning
and the whole thing crashed throughout the day. I mean,
Throughout the
but
day, beginning in the day, and it never came back up.
even if it had worked, it wasn't solving the problem that they were trying to solve, which is that 3 p.m. is too late in the day to modify the behavior of somebody who isn't voting.
And yet, and I apologize for
Yeah.
interrupting, but in apropos form, given the disparity between the two campaigns, the Romney campaign spent much of that day telling everyone, including their own supporters, that it actually was working, and they had great insights into who was voting. And
That's right.
where.
So they knew who was
Literally,
voting.
They were getting information from like CNN. So
And but everybody could have known who voted at like
Correct.
8 p.m. It's it's not a mystery to figure out how many votes you have in a given precinct, and it doesn't serve you a lot of good at 3 p.m. But so I think that this sort of central problem that everything we know from these experiments is that meaningful interaction, that the gold standard for changing somebody's behavior to turn a non-voter into a voter is to have a meaningful interaction with a volunteer at a door. People have run experiments testing what they call chatty scripts, which are these sort of unstructured interactions where there's a back and forth between a canvasser and a voter, as opposed to somebody just reading at you for 45 seconds. A chatty script actually changes somebody's likelihood of voting. So we know that there are these sort of optimal interactions and ways to sequence them with mail and phone calls. But they actually take the real world sort of shoe leather work of developing meaningful interactions. The real world and technology can be a way of supporting that and directing those activities, but it is not going to be in any way a substitute or replacement for it.
No, yeah, it's totally right. And one of the through lines, I think, in your book, and I was thinking throughout it, is sort of like everything old is new again. I mean, if you look at sort of classic political organizations well before modern technology, down to like back in the days in New York where you had real precinct level political organization and you had, political clubs that mattered. And you talk about sort of bowling alone and a lot of the sort of social theory stuff there. The through line, I think, between the Hay email and the white letter experiment and the door knocking is that they're all based on sort of authentic human personal interaction. And while technology helps you put them together, at the end of the day, I would venture, and we see this in a lot of the online organized experiments we do with clients and offline, the more authentic and real and informal and personal something sounds and feels, it's not terribly I think the Gerber and Green work was incredibly important as we're putting it out there, but when you think about it, it's not terribly shocking. Like, I think a recorded thing on your phone is not nearly as effective as your neighbor knocking on your door and saying, hey, I'm going to, work on, I'm going to vote for so-and-so, you should come do it too. I do think it's hard to know why, but I do think one of the reasons that the AFL and some of the institutions on the left gravitated to this first is before the technology, the core of their organizing work was based on chatty scripts and organizing. And if you look at, if you pull an Acorn organizing manual from 1973, it does talk about how to engage people in a chatty conversation and authentic communication. And I think what's incredible is that technology has made those tools and taken them to scale. Yeah. And it has allowed volunteer organizing, and one field organizer dropped in somewhere to disaggregate that, and it's put it together in a way that's just radically more effective. But I think it's sort of taking what's old and making it new again.
And what we know, it's still a huge mystery what campaign ads do, what their influence is, which is one reason that this debate over what the Bain ads did will go on forever. But we do know for certain through these experiments that there are things that happen when a volunteer knocks on a door or has a meaningful phone interaction that TV ads cannot replace. And that is something that, in certain ways, it should be obvious to us that matters, but it was radical after 30 years of almost monomaniacal obsession with maximizing one's TV presence to understand that that there are other types of interactions that have a unique ability, not necessarily to change people's opinions, but to get them to do something that they're not used to doing, which is voting or registering.
And if I may, that actually reminds me of another story from 2008. I was working on Hillary Clinton's campaign, and there was an event where it was a big event where all the candidates in the Democratic primary had a lot of supporters, and the Clinton people were pretty excited about their crowd, but Obama's crowd was even bigger, but they were really young. And I remember some of the senior Clinton people were reporting back to us. They said very dismissively, "Don't worry, their crowd looked like Facebook." Yeah. And that was sort of like them being like, "Ha ha ha." But what I think they really failed to understand was that Facebook was a legitimate way for people to communicate now. And so, and as it turned out, in the Iowa caucus, Obama obviously won and expanded the electorate in a big way.
So, Sasha, you said something earlier about the the infrastructure that the Democratic Party has built. The Analyst Institute, the New Organizing Institute. Jonathan, I know you and your firm are a part of this. My question is kind of a two-part question. First, does the Republican Party's stances on particular issues that tend to be salient to this population of techies, like gay rights or immigration or the environment, and the fact that the Republican Party tends to be on the wrong side of those issues for that population, does that mean that they're not going to be able to attract enough of those bright young minds to be able to catch up? And the second part, of course, is how long will it take to catch up? Democrats were way behind in 2004, and in about 4 years, kind of vaulted ahead with money and, harvesting young minds. Can it be done, and how long will it take for Republicans?
So, part of what I did for this book was go back and try to re-report the 2004 campaign from the sort of innovation perspective. And the story that we had after that campaign was Karl Rove was so brilliant, the Republicans invented micro-targeting, and they knew that if you drank bourbon, you were going to be a Republican, and if you drank gin, you were going to be a Democrat. And with that information alone, they magically found all these evangelicals in the exurbs and made them vote for Bush, and that's why they won.
Also, if you went to Applebee's. Remember that?
Go to Apple, yeah.
And the Golf Channel.
And the thing about this mythology that sort of emerged after in late 2004, early 2005, is it served everybody. It served everybody's interests to have this mythology emerge. So the consultants who had been involved in the Bush campaign and had sort of stuck by their confidentiality agreements and the general sort of like omerta of campaign and didn't talk about these techniques during the campaign. The moment after Election Day, went out and hired PR firms to get stories written about them so that they could go out and find new clients. So they wanted to brag about things. They had a press corps that had no ability to understand what were totally novel techniques in politics, and so they were able to basically, make stuff up. I have people like, we made up the stuff about what liquor you drink mattering, or like whether you have a Subaru being in any way useful information for politics. But these stories got written that operated under this assumption that all micro-targeting is about finding these, like, your buying patterns and using them for politics. In the magazines you read all this stuff, most of which is entirely unhelpful for any political purpose, even if campaigns do have access to it. But the folks on the left were sort of willing, eager sort of collaborators in this project of mythologizing Rove, mostly because, at least until very recently, people on the left seem to love nothing more than thinking Karl Rove is smarter than they are. But also because the sort of it serves people's interests if they're going out and trying to get money from their funders or their donors or investors, or you have some entrepreneurial project to go claim, if we don't figure out how to catch up with the Republicans, Karl Rove's going to run America for the next generation. And that turned out to be a huge driver of investment, contributions, and most importantly, getting people who had traditionally been competitors with one another, consultants or groups, to collaborate on creating these sort of extramural institutions like the New Organizing Institute, the Analyst Institute, to coordinate research projects and disseminate information. And the most important thing that happened was you had people who, 4 days out of a week, direct mail vendors, phone vendors, groups like League of Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club, who are in certain ways competitors. 4 days out of the week, these people would be pitching the same clients or trying to get the same people to join their organizations in a way that was very much a zero-sum game. And on the fifth day, they'd meet for lunch and show PowerPoints about the research that they did and share it with people. And it was only the fear that they were in this sort of face this existential predicament as technologically disadvantaged Democrats, were they willing to do this thing that went entirely contrary to all of their short-term interests, and in many cases their profit models. what I realized in re-reporting all this was that the gap between the two parties in 2004 was far smaller in reality than everybody sort of believed, and that within, certainly by election day 2006, Democrats had reached parity on using statistical modeling and micro-targeting. That actually the Kerry campaign was far closer to doing what Bush did in 2004, but that there are huge advantages to being a presidential reelection campaign, that you have this long period of time, and you can build in your systems, and you can, get buy-in among everybody down to junior staffers to take this stuff seriously. In the Kerry campaign, much like Romney was trying to, in 6 months or 8 months, trying to replicate a system that had sort of been being built and planned for 4 years. And by the end of 2006, I think almost all of the major gains from people in politics looking at the commercial world and consumer marketing and trying to integrate both their data and their techniques into politics had been realized. In the last 6 years, the biggest gains I think have come from the tools of the social sciences, especially experiments, and integrating those into campaigns and broadening the range of questions that you can start to answer empirically. And that's a place where there's a huge cultural problem for Republicans.
And interestingly enough, as Sasha writes in this book, there are exceptions in the Republican Party. Some who, maybe because of their own sort of intellectual orientation, have brought social scientists into their midst. The leading example being Rick Perry.
Right. Yeah. In 2006.
True.
Or before 2006, Dave Carney, who was Perry's top political advisor, and had been a general consultant, which is basically a role that's sort of more prevalent in Republican campaigns than Democratic campaigns these days. But he likens it to being the contractor at a construction site. He's the person who brings in the carpenter and the plumber and the mason, and brings in the phone guy and the web guy and the mail guy, and is sort of the person who sort of referees all of these arrangements. And he had been around consultants long enough to be deeply suspicious of their motives, basically, because that part of the problem in the way that these sort of tables come together around a campaign is that when you have a strategic question, or people's sort of tactical solutions to it are almost always tied to the product or service that they sell a campaign, right? So you sit around and you say, like, we're down among married women, what are we going to do? And the phone guy is always going to say, like, we should have robocalls with, Ellen, and the and the mail guy is going to say, like, we should, send direct mail pieces with pink houses on them, and the TV guy is always going to say we should do more TV ads, and Carney was bothered by the fact that he had no way of sort of confidently assessing the relative effectiveness of each of these tools. So when he found out that there were academics who were doing this, he wasn't so much drawn to it as a science project, but he thought this was a way to use academics basically to audit the people who are selling services to the campaign. But the one thing that Perry had in common with Bush in 2004 and Obama in 2012 is that they were basically the closest thing you have to permanent enterprises in the world of politics. Perry had run his first, he'd run for lieutenant governor in 98. He'd been running statewide since 1990. He could run for governor indefinitely in Texas. Clearly, somewhere in that world, there was an inkling that he could run for president one day. And so the big challenge for campaigns at any level doing tests is, am I going to put aside money for something that might not yield lessons until after Election Day? And am I willing, for the sake of a control group, to take people out of the universe of people that I will contact so that I can measure the effect of the people, of what I'm doing on the people I do contact? And it's a really hard thing to sell. There are methodological solutions to this that should be convincing, but you go to a campaign manager and say that we're going to run a test, and what we're going to do is we're going to, those 20,000, the people that you want to talk to, we're not going to talk to them to see what happens to the other 80,000 people. That's a really hard sell. And each of these institutions, including Perry's, were big, permanent institutions that were willing to make those investments to get smarter next year and the year after. Same thing about the AFL-CIO. Same thing about Emily's List. Getting 2 or 3% smarter next year is of great value to these organizations. And so the big challenge that any campaign or organization has is how to in trying to innovate and be appropriately skeptical of practices, is how to deal with the fact that campaigns are by nature ephemeral, especially candidate campaigns, and how to figure out what problems you need to solve in the next 6 months and where you can create structures of permanence that allow you to get smarter year over year. And that, the places that the innovation is happening right now, whether it's the Obama campaign or the Analyst Institute, or are places that have figured out some ability to live on and ask questions that can be solved outside of the confines of 2-year cycles.
The caveat to that, though, since I'm mildly obsessed with this chapter of Sasha's book, as Sasha knows, is it is worth noting, though, that other than we all know how the Rick Perry campaign ended, he is currently the least popular governor in the country, and this goes to your point about the ephemeral nature of the analytics, how it gets used, how it gets transferred from one race to the next. This has bedeviled both parties, and this has bedeviled all of these campaigns. And so I know that's what OFA is attempting to do now with this sort of permanent campaign that the Obama folks are doing, but I don't know that it will live on. We've seen Harold Ickes attempted to do it with Catalyst, right? And that's basically just become a company. So
yeah, one cautionary note that I assume the professionals will echo that should hang over all of this is, since we spent the last hour and a half romanticizing new techniques, none of these are things that will turn an unpopular politician to a popular one, or will make issues that people don't care about salient to them, or will turn a party that's not trusted to wield power into a credible institution, or change the way people see the economy. These are all things that, all these experiments are things that are finding boosts of 1, 2, 3, 4 points in turnout, or that are bringing down the cost of registering a voter by pennies or maybe dollars, or that are allowing you to be 5% or 20% more efficient in how you spend resources that you already have in voter contact. None of these are things that change the overall architecture of a race, but they are things that could be incredibly valuable for campaigns at the margins to figure out how to maximize the resources that you do have by making sure you're doing things that have measurable impact and are being directed at the place where you can deliver that impact most effectively.
Sorry.
I just think another way to make the point that Sasha just made very clearly, but to really kind of give a real life example here, is look at the primary field in 2012 for the Republican nomination. You had people like, let's say, Tim Pawlenty, who was the governor of Minnesota, and who put together a pretty sophisticated team, or experienced team, I should say. I don't even think he made it to a single primary, right?
No,
So
he dropped out shortly after the straw poll.
Right, and so he could have had all these systems in place for pulling the vote and getting his vote out, but didn't even make it to the primaries. And the reason for that is a number of reasons, and I'm sure Maggie is a foremost expert on this, and she can spell them out. But a couple of them are that he had some bad debate performances, he didn't do well in this straw poll, and so when you don't do well, kind of in the media game, and then money starts to dry up, and then other things happen, you don't even make it to primary day, then all these things that we're talking about here are, not relevant.
He ran a very top-heavy campaign. He had a ton of consultants. He was also, I say this as somebody who likes Tim Pawlenty, but he was not exactly lighting the world on fire. You can argue, and many are right now within the Republican Party and elsewhere in Iowa and elsewhere, that the straw poll is an archaic and stupid method for measuring candidates, and it's essentially a shakedown operation. I think, you hear the pushback from social conservatives saying that that's essentially the establishment trying to force a candidate down people's throats in Iowa, because the straw poll has tended to be dominated by social conservatives. Tim Pawlenty was attempting to be both a social conservative and a mainstream candidate. You really can't be both.
But I only mentioned Pawlenty as an example. Herman Cain's another. There were other Republicans, obviously, who were in the race and then didn't even make it to the first primary, and so all this talk about how we're going to get voters out and all that. You got to get there first,
Well,
and that's where media and other stuff comes into play. I would argue.
But that's to get back to just your initial question about conventional wisdom and what changes. I mean, the conventional wisdom that I guess the truest answer to that was that the idea that any of these candidates other than Mitt Romney ever really had a chance. I mean, beyond Rick Perry, candidly. I mean, once Rick Perry failed, it was always going to be Mitt Romney. There were. He was the only person who had an operation that could do it, and he was the only person. Yes, he was Mr. 25% for a very long time in the primaries, but he was the only one who was at 25%. So it was always going to be Romney or an alternative who could raise the money and pull it off. And once Rick Perry proved that he could raise the money but not pull it off, that was basically it. And the conventional wisdom that we were all writing, Gingrich surging, and Gingrich declared on ABC that he was going to be the nominee at one point, a couple weeks before the caucuses. That obviously did not come to play. So I would just say the conventional wisdom that this was always, that the primary was much of a primary was also false.
So let me take this in a slightly different direction. So much was done and so innovatively by the Obama campaign to target certain voters with certain messages. My question is, how can advocacy groups out there, because I know there's people in the audience who are part of advocacy groups, how can they do the same thing, apply these same tools, except not when it comes to turning out voters, but when it comes to persuading their representative to vote a certain way?
Sure. I think the Gerber.
I think this, Jonathan and then Blake.
I think the Gerber and Green stuff is sort of the core of that, and I think you're seeing that in a huge piece. I mean, most advocacy campaigns don't need to do what a candidate needs to do. You don't actually have an election day where 50% of the voters do something. Most elected officials don't actually hear from that many real people. They get these sort of automatically generated emails. To the extent that any advocacy group can mobilize some small number of people into real action, they can have a tremendous effect. And to the extent that groups invest in basic identification of likely supporters, some basic tactics to turn them out, you can go pretty far. I mean, the example I gave earlier on the Malchow, Wisconsin experiment, we were actually sending mail not to members of the advocacy organization, but to a really widely not that researched kind of intuitive guess of a target, because the issue was so persuasive. Their problem was just getting it in front of people and salience. And we did the blank letter thing, and it generated thousands of individual contact, off of which they then called people. They turned out a small. If you're willing to write the letter off of the white letter, some percentage of you are willing to actually patch through and do the phone call, and some smaller percentage of you are willing to go to the meeting. And for most legislative issue campaigns, that's a lot. The amount of advocacy campaigns where, we walk in and talk to a client and we say, how many members do you have? And they say, none. And if you actually get to 30, 40, 50, seeing it from the other side, we have political clients, statewide elected officials in a state as big as New York, who if they get, 300 real sticky human contacts, not sort of fake electronic petitions, they freak out and have a meeting about the issue, which is kind of nuts in a state of this many millions of people. And we see it over and over again. All clients call and say, this fracking thing, and we're hearing about it a lot. Well, what happened? We got 12 actual letters.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that, it's actually a much, 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 much lower bar. And I think you're seeing it. It's just a question of investing in sort of sticky organizing that moves people to action. If you have the budget to actually do some targeting, some of these tools I do think could help you identify who to speak to. A lot of our clients, especially in city and state work, don't have those kinds of budgets. They're stringing it together. Unions do. Groups like LCV does. But you look at the frackers, which are farmers. It's incredible without these kinds of resources. And I think it's using these tools to adapt them to their context.
So I have one or two more questions I definitely want to get to, but first I want to see if there's any questions in the audience. Oh, yep, there's a few. In the back, since you're right next to Brian back there.
Hi. Thanks. This question's for anybody who can kind of speak to it, but we talked a lot about the Obama campaign versus the Romney campaign, but in New York City in 2013, a lot of the game is about primary races, and how can these techniques be applied? And we talked about, consultants coming together and using the research together, but also how can these techniques be applied in primary campaigns and targeting the voters that way?
Arguably, there's more of a need to do granular targeting of voters in a primary, and people always have, because you're looking for really small distinctions that obviously partisanship is not a predictor for, partisan. If I'm trying to guess how somebody's likely to vote, partisanship, your registration gets me 85% of the way there. And the other things that contribute to that prediction are things that are pretty obvious, like your age and your race and education level and stuff like that. Obviously, you don't have that kind of anchoring attribute in a primary, which is why even before micro-targeting, races in New York were an example of people thinking on a whole number of levels about fairly small distinctions of race or ethnicity or neighborhood or class. What's just changed is that the unit at which you can make those determinations has gone down from big demographic categories or geographical jurisdictions to individuals. Now, you can build a statistical model that predicts the answer to any question or any attribute. And so, if you can come up with, if you want to come up with an Afro-Caribbean model, you can. Basically, what you do is you call some thousands of people and you ask them what their ethnicity is, and then you run an algorithm that weighs the relative influence of different variables on predicting that. And my guess is that last name and census tract and zip code will probably be major contributors to that model. But if you go in and your assumption is that we want to, target Afro-Caribbean women, you can come up with a way to pull a universe of people who match that attribute, and you don't have to be worried about partisanship. And some of those models are things that somebody will do a national one or a statewide one, and there are vendors that collect these models, and you can buy access to, somebody created an Afro-Caribbean model in 2007 and you buy it, right? Some of them are things that if you have a particular issue that you want to model somebody's likelihood of agreeing with you on, you may have to go out and do those thousands of phone calls and do the analysis or have a firm do it, and that's more costly and requires some time and planning. And but there's nothing that you cannot use micro-targeting techniques to come up with individual level predictions around, as long as it's basically a question that can be asked in a poll that you can predict an answer to.
I think there was a question right here.
My question is, it's been established that door knocking has the highest percentage of efficacy in terms of voter contacts. Especially for Jonathan, you might have an answer on this. Has there been any example of a door knocking operation in a metropolitan area where it's buildings as opposed to individual houses, especially when you're facing like a Democratic primary?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the 2009 New York City elections and the election of the current public advocate, controller, and probably a couple dozen members of the city council, those were the results of very large-scale canvassing operations. I do think actually in New York City for a long time there's been a huge investment in canvassing. In a way, it's better in New York. If you're in a high-rise building, you can get to you're not walking half a block
As long
down.
as you have a resident inside.
Yeah. It does get. There are neighborhoods where it gets hard, right? And so you can't do it in parts of Park Avenue, and you have to work around it. But there are huge swaths of New York City where you can gain access. I mean, I remember having high school volunteers on campaigns in 2001, where their job was to go through volunteers to find people who would give our door knockers access to buildings with buzzers. And so for every building in a complex like Stuytown, we'd have the person who would be home and would agree to buzz them in, or you get the doorman, or whatever, and that becomes actually a task on campaigns in New York. Going back to something, I mean, issues really, really matter. I don't want to say it's all tactics, but to the extent that there is a voter contact tactic that's incredibly effective, there's a long history of large-scale investment in door-to-door canvassing in New York City that's yielded a lot for winning campaigns.
I mean, one reason that Democrats and the left have a far more advanced culture and set of tactics around field than Republicans do is that it's a simple fact of geography
Cities.
that Democrats live in denser areas.
Cities, yep.
You can go back 50 years. There were very few 80% Republican precincts anywhere in the country. Any 80% Republican precinct voting Republican precinct in the country right now is, it's in Idaho or it's in like Northwest Arkansas. It wouldn't be walkable. You'd have to drive 9 minutes from door to door. And so it is in a very rational way, has never made sense for a lot of Republican organizations to do the training and nurturing that's involved around canvassing programs. Places where you have, even in the era of precinct targeting, before micro-targeting, when the goal would be, let's just overwhelm our strongest precincts and mobilize everybody, because we're going to get 80% of the votes there. So if 1 out of 5 people that we turn out's a Republican, big deal, we'll make it up on volume. Those are in big cities or college towns or inner-ring suburbs where you can knock on a lot of doors in an hour. And so, one of the big differences in the way, if you're looking for one single way of understanding why the Romney campaign got it so wrong with Orca and the Obama campaign got the integration of technology and field right, it's that Jim Messina, the manager of the Obama campaign, just because he was a young Democrat, knocked on a whole lot of doors earlier in his career. I would venture that Matt Rhodes, who is the manager of Romney's campaign, has never knocked on a door in his life. Most senior Republicans never have. They've never, and so all of this stuff is about applying a craft and rigor to this very old-fashioned form of contact. But you need to be in a place where you see that there's a good way to knock on a door and a bad way to knock on a door, and that there are systems that you build around it to refine it. And the fact is that, Democrats, whether party organizations or unions or student groups, have that culture and experience, and there are very few places on the right that sort of replicate that. And it's almost all a function of density.
And I think that reference to unions is a really important one when it comes to New York City. I mean, there's a reason why labor unions like 32BJ, 1199, Hotel Trades Council are so sought after. And it's not necessarily because candidates assume that if a voter hears that, they were endorsed by those unions, that they're going to be persuaded on that alone. It's many of them have very sophisticated get out the vote efforts that involve door-to-door canvassing and knocking and all that kind of stuff, and that really can separate them. And that's kind of the rare example where endorsements actually really can matter, and that's because of door knocking, in part.
Brian?
To follow up on an earlier question, New York City is unique in its campaign and its public financing of campaigns with a 6-to-1 matching fund ratio. How does that change the picture in a New York City municipal election with respect to city council, borough presidents, and the 3 citywide offices?
In terms of the mayor's race, if they all raise the same amount of money, they will all have the same amount of money, and so that's always been a misconception, especially among with the press, frankly, with the mayor's races here. The obvious difference being that Bloomberg has existed outside of that framework rather dramatically. But in terms of the primary, Billy Thompson is off, and Jonathan can speak to this probably more specifically than I can, but Billy Thompson, he doesn't work for Billy Thompson, but I think he's more familiar with the particulars. But Bill Thompson, who was the nominee in 2009, obviously, I think has not been fundraising as aggressively, right, so far. So he would be the question mark as to whether he'll hit he'll max out. But typically they all max out, and so it becomes sort of a level playing field, which is why, to Blake's point, why especially 1199 has historically been so important. In the 2001 Democratic mayoral primary, it was the get. And they are exceptionally good at canvassing. I don't know how effective they've been in more recent years, but certainly in the late 90s and early 2000s.
One of the things we've learned from all these Gerber and Green experiments is that paid canvassers or callers are less effective at mobilizing people than volunteer canvassers or callers. There have been experiments where call centers, where the caller doesn't identify him or herself as a volunteer, but people can hear whether it's somebody in Omaha reading a script or it's a real person calling with a cause or candidate that they probably believe in. And it turns out that actually has an appreciable effect on changing the behavior of the person on the other end of a call, which is even in situations where you have huge resource disparities, there's an advantage to having volunteers, or in the cases of unions, basically people who are paid on and around election day to go work on politics instead of doing their jobs. Because it's actually, we know it's empirically, it's more effective at getting the results that you want. And so, when you see parity in terms of money, then the question is, what can you do that doesn't actually, where you're not relying on paid programs, especially to do voter contact.
Sasha, to your point, when I ran for Congress on election day, we had like 600 volunteers at the poll sites. My leading opponent had paid people. And when I'd go around from poll site to poll site, my volunteers were handing out my literature, and my opponent had a yard sign at every location with a plastic bag tied around the yard sign with the literature in it. Which obviously the people who'd been paid to do that for the day went there in the morning, put the sign up, and then went home or took a 5-hour lunch break or whatever. So just to your point about efficacy of actual volunteers. And the scripting thing is interesting. In my race, we found that people did better with no script. We did randomized experiments back then, and we gave them like just a standard script versus, hey, tell them why you're volunteering. And that turned out to be more effective. So, Jackie, you got anybody? Okay, right there.
Hello. So I produce a national radio show, but I come here as a student tonight. And sometimes I can be in a media bubble where you think every single interview is a big deal. So my question is kind of two parts. Excuse me. But the first part is, what form of media is best used to mobilize, to move a voter when a candidate gives an interview? Is it print media, TV, or radio? And then second, how effective is an interview that a candidate does have an effect in mobilizing voters to come out and volunteer?
It's whatever you read on Politico.com, I think.
Anything Maggie Haberman writes.
Historically, not just there.
Anywhere, actually.
You can speak to this much better than I can, though.
That's my answer. Is anything you're right. Now, look, I defer to my colleagues here. I mean, news has different effects. I don't think most of the time campaigns. Look, in a presidential where there's like a national narrative and like Obama talks about Bane's on the news, that's a pretty sui generis situation. I know it's sort of like the big national conversation, but the candidates for mayor in the city are out every night talking about whatever, and you to go home and turn on the 11 o'clock news, you're not going to see them. They're not making news most of the time. And there's a process story on the mayoral race in New York City in the dailies every single day. But at this point, it's generally not a voter conversation, right? It is laying out predicate on positions, and people are using these interviews to sort of say, like, lay out positions, push their candidates on positions, signal influencers, and it's often to sort of make news to sort of have something to come back to later, if that makes sense. I think candidates think about media as it's of course a way to get your message out. You want voters to read it, you want voters to see it. Different people access different things. I mean, there's some empirical in some of this, like. In New York City, more people watch Eyewitness News on Channel 7, at 6 and 11, than read all the newspapers. It just is what it is. At the same time, you get a great editorial in the New York Times that's it's the gold standard, and you slap it on your piece of mail, and voters walk into the polling place with it. So it's hard to say, if we're going to give the interview to so-and-so X. It's more about thinking about what the purpose of media is in a race. And I just think it's important. I think presidential races are so uniquely different than anything else in this regard.
One thing I'll note is I think that what we've seen, and this kind of gets back to that my skepticism about the idea that enthusiasm is a driver of turnout.
Yeah.
Is it that 15 years of these experiments have pointed, I think, to a really clean distinction between persuasion, which is the project of changing somebody's mind, influencing their opinions about candidates or about the issues, or about the state of the economy, and mobilization, which is we really understand is about modifying people's behavior. And this is something that psychologists intuitively understand the difference between opinion formation and behavior modification, but I think people in politics have been slow to understand how entirely different those are as modes of communication or influence. And one thing we've seen, so people have done all these experiments, and it turns out that they put political messages on get out the vote reminders about issues or about this is good for your community or whatever. It does nothing to influence people's likelihood of voting. The stuff that influences somebody's likelihood of voting are a lot of behavioral nudges, telling somebody that their voting record is that their vote history is a matter of public record. People can know whether or not you vote. Referring to people as a voter, as the type of person who votes, raising the salience of their identity as a good citizen, telling people that turnout's going to be high. All of these are things that are not about the candidates. They're about individual self-regard, their desire to fit in, their desire to be seen as a good citizen. And what I think that's showing us is that when we're talking about behavioral questions, which voting, registering, volunteering, the way to do that is probably to change the social dynamic around it, but not necessarily to have that having a candidate go out and talk about issues is probably not going to modify the behavior of people who are not used to volunteering to go volunteer for your candidate. And that's what all of these things that we're seeing from these experiments around canvassing are calling that the reason you want a meaningful interaction with chatty scripts and volunteers is that these are human interactions that change the social dynamic around voting. We're in a country where voting's not compulsory. In most elections, your vote does not make a difference. Sorry, it's true. So the question is, how do you get people who are not used to doing this thing to do it? And it turns out that often it's changing the social dynamic around it. So I think that part of it is you sort of said what types of communications work to mobilize people. I think you should think very differently about whether you're really trying to persuade them or you're trying to mobilize them.
The one caveat, though, and I'm sorry, just very quickly, the one caveat I would add, though, to Jonathan's point, municipal elections are different generally than presidential elections. In New York, it's really different, and especially right now, we're at this very odd moment where social media is prevalent, but this is such an established media market that it's very hard to say sort of what is seeping in and what isn't. It was pretty clear in 2009. It's less clear now. The nature of the newspapers are different. People don't really watch local news the way they used to, and even if these candidates were on them, local news has much less of an impact than it used to. It's not clear how Twitter or a lot of sort of websites are playing a role. And we're at this strange moment in New York where we've had a guy as mayor for 12 years and he's about to leave. And so the Democratic primary is being viewed through that lens as opposed to a lot of other things. You have four candidates, if I count John Liu, who are pretty similar in terms of most of their social views. And so what is going to move a voter is going to be, I think, a little harder to discern. But tell me if you guys disagree.
Oh, no, I just think to kind of get to the specific question about newspaper, or I guess print versus radio versus TV, just to bring it back to that, there are sort of two ways that campaigns tend to look at these things, which is there's what we kind of refer to as free media, and then there's paid media. And so with free media, that's free from the campaign's perspective. That means an interview or something like that, right? And then paid media, of course, is when you're actually paying for the opportunity to be in there, and that's an advertisement. And just to get objective about it, the ad rates for TV are far higher than they are for radio and for print. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's more effective, but that tells you that in the marketplace of ideas that's driving the ad rates, that campaigns generally believe that being on TV is more valuable than, no offense, than radio. And print. So that's one way to kind of look at it.
Andrew, what's your question?
Yeah, building off both of what you just said, much of the country now, money is unlimited for some candidates, and we saw that here in New York for the last 3 mayor's races. To what degree does bought time on TV shape the race, first of all? Second of all, to what degree is what Bloomberg did in 2009, was that really about behavioral nudging to make it look like he was inevitably going to win? Fundamentally, though, I really want to understand, in this environment of unlimited cash for certain candidates, how do you counter the weight of the television presence?
Well, as best we know, television is we have very little empirical research about this. What we have seen is that television can change people's opinions. The impact tends to wear off pretty quickly, so the impact of TV decays. What you see, that the Rick Perry people did these experiments. There have been other non-experimental efforts to measure this, that you can move public opinion, but that once you go off the air after a few days, it goes away. This is actually a place where conventional wisdom among large parts of the media consulting class is sort of appears to be borne out. People say you go up and you stay up, don't go up unless you can keep it going. The limited amount of research we have sort of bears that out. There's not a lot of evidence, so I think we should be thinking of that as a persuasion tool, though. I think I think we have probably good reason to be skeptical of TV as a mobilization tool. And the problem with TV as a mobilization tool isn't just the question of its effectiveness, but that you want to be really targeted about who you turn out. And the whole idea is that whether you're using, volunteers, canvassers who are IDing voters to figure out who your supporters are, or you're using micro-targeting as kind of a shortcut to extrapolate who's likely to be your supporter even if you haven't interacted with them, you don't want to indiscriminately mobilize everybody in a media market or everybody who watches the local news. And so people are using TV to influence voters' opinions, but they're not using it as an effort to indiscriminately encourage people to vote.
And interestingly enough, typically when you see a candidate with that kind of wealth, they'll just immediately think, I'm going to dump 70% of it on TV. And Maggie has a great piece this morning, which you guys should read, about Rick Scott, who's the governor of Florida. He's a billionaire, and he says, I'm going to spend $100 million for my reelection, which he needs to because he might be more unpopular than Rick Perry. But one thing he said, interestingly enough, he said, I'm going to spend most of it on data analytics in the way Obama did. And that brings me to the last question, and you all get 30 seconds to answer because I got to go teach in a minute here. And here's the question. What does Obama do with this treasure trove of data? We know what he's going to try to do with it now, which is, I just got an email 2 minutes ago. Okay, and it's about immigration reform, so he's going to try to mobilize it in the next year or two on behalf of his agenda. But what does he do with it in 2014? Because he was notoriously tight-fisted with his time, his money, and his data when it came to down-ballot candidates this cycle. What does he do with it in 2014, and what does he do with it in 2016?
The thing that the sort of post-campaign Obama world is doing that I think is sort of most exciting and interesting and potentially promising is not necessarily the organizing for action, the 501c4 version that's doing a lot of this sort of advocacy work around the president's agenda, but something that the best thing of which was one of Maggie's colleagues, Ken Vogel, wrote on Politico recently, which is it's something your care, ensure your care. I don't know if these groups all have horrible names. Enroll America. That was called, I don't know. The idea is that they've created an entity that's designed to encourage people to take advantage of the provisions of Obamacare, of the Affordable Care Act, and are using, the goal is to use data and analytics to target that outreach, use some of the campaign's instincts around voter contact and canvassing to actually create meaningful interactions. And there the goal is to modify behaviors of citizens so that they can, benefit from the most significant piece of legislation that that Obama enacted in his first term. This is I think really interesting and especially for Democrats who are invested in the project of making citizens value what government does and an activist government does, that not just looking at short-term outcomes like getting somebody to vote or register or call their congressperson, but actually getting them to understand what government does for them and take advantage of it, holds up the potential to create long-term interactions and a sort of political connection with one's base that would seem to go beyond sort of the ephemeral stuff of election cycles. And so I think that's something that's I'll actually sort of watch a little more closely than whether they help a particular candidate in 2014 with a walk list.
I'll focus on what doesn't matter, which is the candidates. I think they're going to do very little in 2014. I don't think I think Obamaism is what Obama stands for, and that will continue. In 2016, it's going to depend on precisely who is running. I don't think that at the moment he has an interest in bestowing.
And I'm not even necessarily saying in a primary. I'm just saying a lot of Democratic donors didn't give because they love Barack Obama. Right. They gave, we saw Ben Smith had a piece saying 85%, I think, of $200+ dollar donors still hadn't given a couple months out from the election. They were giving to beat Mitt Romney. If they were giving because of Obama, they would have already given earlier. So does he owe the party? Does he owe it to the party to bequeath this data to the DNC?
Probably. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. So we'll see.
Jonathan.
I have no idea what's going to happen. I defer to the wiser minds to my right.
Does he owe it to the party?
I mean, look, I think as progressives, we hope that if we've invested billions of dollars in infrastructure and some of the finest minds in how to move and persuade people, that we use that to the greater good.
Like,
And it's not just to his party, it's to his own agenda. I mean, if he had put a little more effort in 2012 to trying to get a Democratic House, we might have had a, a less interesting but more effective last couple of months. I mean, I wrote an article in, I think, July or August for the Daily News saying he should start doing that, get involved in Democratic House races. The pushback that I got, not just from Obama people, but also political scientists and others, was that actually the way the maps are drawn and other factors right now, it's actually, you know, bad news for Democrats. It's actually not looking like it's possible for that to happen anytime soon in terms of the Dems regaining the House. But to answer your question, I think it would be very useful, obviously, for Obama to have a Congress that will work with him. And so it's, you know, to that extent in his best interest to do so.
Sasha will be signing books at the back table. Thank you guys. You were amazing.
Thank you.